while it is true that it's been many years since Silent Hill has put out an actual game, other than the partially started and subsequently canned Silent Hills from Konami a few years ago, even still, you would have to be living under a rock to not be familiar with the franchise, at least passingly. The truth is, Silent Hill is an absolute pillar of excellence in the survival horror genre, even today, and even despite a few missteps here and there. It is also absolutely true that many great classic horror games have come and gone since the last great Silent Hill game. You could even argue that some of them have outdone Silent Hill in many of its own areas of strength, like storytelling and atmosphere. Even still, classics are classics, and there is no denying that Team Silent's fourth installment in the Silent Hill series is an absolute survival horror tour de force in its own right, despite also being a bit of a dark horse of the series at the same time. Silent Hill 4 gives you more or less a fresh slate from the interlocking stories of 1 and 3 that the series would somewhat go back to in Origins a few years later. In that way, it has a lot in common with Silent Hill 2, which many would say is the best game in the series. While Silent Hill 4 is no Silent Hill 2, it does wisely take a page or two from SH2's book, and that's a good thing. For instance, the isolated storyline being divorced from the winding and bizarre story of the original games, and by extension the origin of the town itself, plays right into the hands of Team Silent for the game. This allowed them to take a certain amount of liberty with the ideas that can be present in Silent Hill and take it into some interesting directions that other games might not have had available to them because of the confines of the lore. Neither approach is better than the other, but there is no doubt that one of Silent Hill 2's greatest strengths is that the events that James goes through in the story are all their own. They don't have to add up with the cult, Alessa, or any other integral points of original Silent Hill lore. Silent Hill 2 and Silent Hill 4 both stand on their own within the universe and are better for it. One of the great things about Silent Hill is that it's a bizarre, boundless realm that should be interpreted in many different ways and taken in all sorts of directions, without ever really necessarily contradicting anything that came before. Unlike the storylines of Resident Evil or Clock Tower games, which are sort of hard to make heads or tails of at this point if you consider every entry in them canon, Silent Hill always has the ability to give a fresh slate to a new story that can exist parallel with the other ones, but not necessarily intersecting with them in a way that introduces conflict of any sort. But even if there is some sort of conflict, it can usually be easily explained by alternate timelines or any other narrative device that usually seems lazy but in Silent Hill actually makes a lot of sense. So, the fresh story and the fresh characters all go a long way to making Silent Hill 4 stand out in the series, while also fitting right in with the others at the same time. Speaking of the story of Silent Hill 4, while it definitely starts off a little weirder and slower than other Silent Hill games, it ultimately adds up to one of the better stories in the series. Where other Silent Hill games generally introduce you to what's basically going on fairly early and then subvert your expectations later, Silent Hill 4 goes out of its way to stay very vague and mysterious about what exactly is going on, and forces you to unravel the bizarre ball of yarn through a series of levels divided up in a very interesting way. Right off the bat, you'll notice that Silent Hill 4 starts out as what seems like a first-person game, where the main character is trapped in his apartment. This setup might remind you of PT that Konami released and then took down a few years ago on PSN, but I assure you it was presented and executed in an entirely different way than that was. Here, Henry is trapped in a far more earthly way than the main character of PT is. Tons of chains and bolts and locks all over the door, and you're not entirely sure why. All you really know early on is that you're Henry Townsend, and you're in an apartment, and there appears to be some sort of mystery surrounding a serial killer named Walter, that you can only find out about via small little clips of notes that you occasionally find scattered around the apartment. Gameplay-wise, all you really do at first is explore the apartment and familiarize yourself with your surroundings, until you will eventually discover a mysterious hole in the wall of the bathroom. The hole is not only off-putting in its own right, but it also serves as one of the game's main functions, and you'll get very used to crawling through it, as the only way in and out of Henry's apartment. Going back and forth between Silent Hill 4's levels and Henry's apartment is essentially equivalent to beginning and ending a level in most other games. Every time you come back to Henry's apartment, you find more notes revealing information about the story. You can save, and you feel like you have more or less escaped the danger, at least at first. One of the many genius ways Silent Hill 4 completely subverts the player's expectations is that it flips this concept completely on its head about halfway through. While the room starts out as a safe harbor to heal and save, it eventually becomes a place of torment as the apartment becomes possessed and actively drains Henry's health while he's there. This small little change really ratchets up the dread and makes you feel like the more you play, the less safe you are in Silent Hill 4. As you imagine, Henry comes across several interesting characters throughout the game, some of which are interesting references to other Silent Hill games, but the game keeps everybody firmly rooted in this isolated story. One of the more notable characters, Eileen, turns out to be particularly fascinating, and you'll want to make sure you take care of her when you're in dangerous situations, as her health at the end of the game will determine whether or not she survives, and subsequently the ending you get. The gameplay of Silent Hill 4, many could argue, is a bit of a step up from 2 and 3. While it does still retain some of that PS2 horror game clunkiness to it, it also has a clearer way of illustrating your character's health to you than any other game before it, while also introducing a power meter that can help you gauge how powerful one of your attacks will be based on how long you hold the button. Functionally, this is a nice thing to have in a game where there is a fair amount of combat, but you could also say that having things on the screen like this sort of take away from the experience a little bit, and I think that's a fair point to make. Even still, it's fairly minimal and you don't notice it much as the game goes along, but regardless of how good you get at the combat and managing your life, there are some enemies that don't go down in the simple ways that enemies typically go down in video games. Normally, if you come across something that's bad in a video game, you can dispatch it with enough bullets or strikes with some sort of weapon. Silent Hill 4 courageously bends those rules a little bit, with ghosts that can only be knocked down temporarily or kept down in a more permanent way with a special sword, that if you want to take back, also will let the ghost come back as well. These ghosts can deal just as much damage to Henry as any other enemy in the game, but they are relentless in their pursuit of him to a degree that most other enemies in horror games are not. This is yet another thing to put on the pile of things in Silent Hill 4 that keeps the tension high and the confidence low. There's also a handful of other little quality of life things that Silent Hill 4 does that feel like improvements on the previous games, like simpler puzzles that won't keep you stumped for hours and hours and grind the game to a halt, as well as just generally a simple level structure that again keeps you playing and progressing instead of wondering where you are, or whether or not you should backtrack half the time. While the overall package of Silent Hill 4 might not surpass the original 3 in most players' eyes, it's also fair to say that it took some meaningful stabs at improving the formula. The best way to experience Silent Hill 4 is to just go in blind. If you aren't already familiar with the game at this point, then that makes you a perfect candidate to give this game a real shot and experience it the right way. That way, you won't have the experience ruined for you by spoilers and overly nitpicky analyses that completely litter the internet at this point. If you are a fan of Silent Hill, then this is a perfect way to experience a similar game in the series that plays around with expectations you may have in some interesting ways. If you're a fan of survival horror in general and are willing to dial back your expectations for a nearly 20-year-old game just a little bit, then you could also certainly do a lot worse than Silent Hill 4: The Room. That's it for this video. If you enjoyed and would like to see more, feel free to hit that subscribe button and hit the notification bell to ensure you'll be notified when new videos go up.